Behind Rome's marble columns lay rooms no law dared name the pleasure chambers. Not arenas of combat, but cages of silence, where enslaved boys were trained to smile, to serve, to endure. These chambers were Rome's most guarded secret and its most honest truth. The empire's grandeur wasn't paid in gold, but in the ruined bodies of children hidden behind frescoed walls. Who profited from that silence? Chronicles praise discipline. Archaeology and law codes reveal a market of flesh. If you value the record, subscribe. When the ledgers close, the bones still speak. You kneel in one of these chambers, no windows to the street, no air from the outside. The walls are red with frescoes of gods stealing boys' myths chosen not to comfort, but to justify. Dionysus drunk among satyrs, Zeus. Cradling Ganymede, divine precedent, painted to sanctify domination. The silence is heavy, broken only by the shuffle of sandals across mosaic floors. You are not here by chance. You are here because someone paid. Roman law called you res a thing, property, an object. The legal term stripped you of personhood long before the rope touched your wrists. And so, when you enter the pleasure chamber, there is no crime because the law does not recognize a victim. For the master reclining on the couch, this is not sin, but status. To own such a chamber, to stock it. With delicati, delicate boys groomed for silence, was to declare one's rank as loudly as a triumphal arch. Here, domination was not a byproduct of empire. It was its essence distilled into private ritual. Rome celebrated itself as civilization of law and order. Yet, in these chambers, order revealed its truest form, not justice, but hierarchy. The empire's wealth rested not only on grain ships and tribute, but on the silent consumption of bodies within these painted rooms. Rome was not simply an empire of conquest. It was an empire of ownership. Every marble arch, every aqueduct, every triumphal parade stood on the broken backs of enslaved people. At its peak, nearly 1 in 3 human beings in Rome's territories lived as slaves. That statistic alone should shatter our image of Rome as the civilization of law. Imagine walking through the crowded streets of the capital. Every third face you pass belongs to someone who legally does not exist as a person. The system was total. Enslavement came from everywhere. Captives from foreign wars were sold like livestock in markets that smelled of sweat iron and coin. Children born to enslaved mothers inherited the chain. At birth, their first breath already a legal transaction. Debt could drag a free man into bondage. Kidnapping filled the gaps when war could not. Rome's arteries pulsed with this commerce. Its ports choked with human cargo, its markets echoing with the calls of auctioneers who measured a child's worth in denarii. And over it all loomed the principle of dominia potestas, the master's absolute power. Roman law did not hedge or soften this. Jurists wrote it with chilling clarity. The master had the right of life and death over his slaves. He could sell, beat, mutilate, or kill without crime. To the Republic, and later the Empire, this was not excess, but order, the natural expression of hierarchy. A slave was not persona, but res, not a subject of law, but an object of property. This is where the Roman genius for system reveals its darkest face. Law is supposed to be the shield of the weak. In Rome, law became the master's sword. Regulations existed, but only to protect one owner's property from another's interference. If your neighbor damaged your slave, you could demand compensation, not because the slave had suffered, but because you had lost value. In that framework, cruelty was not simply tolerated, it was sanctified. It was the logical extension of ownership. And yet in public, Rome draped itself in the language of virtus, of discipline, order, manly restraint. Senators thundered about honor generals, staged triumphs that declared Rome's destiny as the bringer of civilization. But what did civilization mean when a third of its people were stripped of personhood? This is the duplicity at the heart of Roman psychology. The forum projected justice. The household enforced domination. On the battlefield, Rome demanded courage. In the villa, Rome demanded silence. The enslaved themselves lived the contradiction daily. A boy bought at auction might be trained to pour wine with grace, to walk without sound, to endure without flinching. He would hear philosophers declaim about the moral superiority of Rome while his own body was treated as disposable. He would watch priests burn incense to the gods while his own cries went unacknowledged because he was not considered human in the eyes of those gods' worshippers. Rome institutionalized this silence not as failure, but as philosophy. The legal framework of Dominia Potestas gave cruelty legitimacy. The architecture of villas gave it privacy. The rituals of Roman religion gave it divine precedent. The economy gave it profit. This was not corruption at the edges. It was the foundation itself. Consider the psychology of power this produced. To be Roman was not simply to be free, it was to dominate. Citizenship meant not only the right to vote or to own land, but the right to own people. The very concept of freedom in Rome depended on unfreedom for others. This inversion is the essence of Roman political psychology. Liberty was not universal. It was a privilege defined by the subjugation of another body. And so the contradiction sharpened. The same society that built monuments to order institutionalized chaos within its homes. The same jurists who codified contracts codified the erasure of millions. Every proclamation of discipline was built on private indulgence. This is the dark arithmetic of Roman power for every senator speaking of dignity. There were dozens of enslaved children silenced behind the walls of his villa. The pleasure chambers we glimpsed in Part 1 were not aberrations. They were the distilled truth of the system. Because once law tells you a boy is not a person, once economy tells you he is property, once architecture tells you he is invisible, then the chamber is inevitable. It is not a deviation from Roman greatness, it is Roman greatness, expressed without disguise, which leaves us with a question. Rome never asked if freedom requires someone else's silence. Is it freedom at all, or merely another mask for domination? If slavery was the foundation of Rome, then the delicatus was its ornament. The living jewel polished for display, the silent proof of a master's refinement. In Roman markets, the price of a boy's youth voice and skin tone could exceed the value of seasoned laborers. Why? Because this was not about work. It was about spectacle, about status, about transforming a human child into the embodiment of an owner's social prestige. The word itself, delicatus, sounds almost affectionate, a term of tenderness. But beneath the euphemism lay a system of grooming and consumption. A delicatus was often a boy chosen for his beauty, purchased young and raised within the villa not as a worker, but as an ornament. he was taught silence first. Then, grace how to pour wine without spilling, how to smile when ordered, how to endure touch without flinching. He was taught music, sometimes poetry, so he could adorn a feast with his voice or presence. But above all, he was taught that resistance was not survival, that compliance was the only path to a longer life. The villas themselves reflected this transformation. Hidden cubicular private chambers were built not for family, but for secrecy. These rooms were often decorated with mythological frescoes. Ganymede, the boy abducted by Zeus to serve as cup-bearer of the gods. Apollo lounging among muses. Dionysus dissolving in ecstasy. The walls themselves justified what happened within them. Myth became propaganda. If the gods took boys, then why not their earthly masters? Each painted figure served as a divine alibi, erasing the need for conscience. To walk into such a chamber was to enter a theatre where cruelty masqueraded as refinement. For the master, the possession of a delicatus was not simply indulgence, it was a mark of sophistication, a symbol that he had reached the pinnacle of Roman luxury. For guests to see such a boy trained and adorned was to recognize the wealth and power of the host. For the boy himself, it was to live in a body stripped of identity, reduced to an aesthetic object consumed like wine or song. Philosophers noticed this, and here the silence of complicity deepens. Cicero could thunder about the virtue of self-control. Seneca could warn against decadence. Juvenal could satirize noblemen who indulged in boys too openly, but none of them condemned the system itself. They mocked excess, not exploitation. They scolded the masters for being too soft, too distracted, too un-Roman in their indulgence. But the suffering of the boys, that was not their concern. To criticize cruelty would require recognizing the enslaved as people, and Rome's intellectuals rarely dared cross that line. This silence is political psychology in its purest form. The ruling class does not need to defend atrocity if it can redefine it as culture. By calling a boy delicatus, Rome could mask domination with delicacy. By painting Ganymede, it could elevate abduction into divine myth. By satirizing luxury, it could normalize cruelty as something inevitable, even laughable. This is how domination becomes invisible, not by hiding it, but by aestheticizing it until no one questions its legitimacy. The escalation lies here. If the foundation of Rome was ownership, then the delicatus was its refinement, the polishing of cruelty into beauty. A boy was no longer simply a body to labor or suffer. He was transformed into a living aesthetic, a luxury consumed at the dinner table, in the bedchamber, in silence. And that silence was the most important feature. For Rome, silence was proof that the system worked. Silence meant there was no scandal, no disruption, no visible rebellion. Silence made cruelty indistinguishable from culture. But silence is not absence. It is performance. Behind every fresco of Apollo stood a boy forced to play Apollo's role. Behind every myth of Ganymede was a child abducted from his home. Behind every polite laugh at juvenile satire was a scream muffled behind marble walls. Rome called it refinement. We should call it what it was: the weaponization of beauty to conceal domination. The question hangs sharper now, when cruelty is polished into art, when domination is made beautiful. How many generations forget it was ever cruelty at all? Step into a Roman villa, and you are walking into a machine. Not just a house, but a structure designed to display power in marble and to conceal its rot in brick. At the entrance, colonnades open to vast atriums where guests marvel at fountains and mosaics. Yet, beyond the atrium, through carefully guarded corridors, the villa bends inward toward rooms meant not for family, but for secrecy. These chambers, small and windowless, were carved into the very blueprint of elite life. They were not mistakes. They were architecture with a purpose to hide what Rome refused to name. Archaeology makes the silence visible. Excavated villas from Pompeii and Herculaneum reveal cubicular tiny bedrooms with no natural light, often accessible only from the master's private quarters. Some walls are painted with bright mythological frescoes, Ganymede lifted by Zeus's eagle Apollo, reclining with muses Dionysus surrounded by satyrs. These images were not decorative whimsy, they were propaganda. They created divine precedent for domination framing exploitation as imitation of the gods. The myth became wallpaper for atrocity, embedding violence into plaster and pigment. Consider what it means when architecture conspires with ideology. A chamber with no window denies witnesses. A door opening only inward denies escape. Walls painted with myths deny guilt. In Rome, stone itself colluded with silence. Cruelty was not performed in the shadows of the system. It was built into its foundation. This is why calling the Delicatus system decadence misses the point. Decadence implies excess corruption, a deviation from virtue. But here, virtue and vice shared the same walls. The same villa that hosted philosophers in its garden had a boy chained in its cubiculum. The same noble who donated marble to temples also paid for frescoes that sanctified his private domination. Architecture reconciled the contradiction. It created zones where law did not enter, where Rome's public image of discipline could coexist with private ritual of cruelty. And what of the enslaved who passed through these rooms? For them, architecture was destiny. A boy sold into a senator's villa might never again see open sky at night. His world shrank to corridors and locked doors to painted myths that mocked his silence. He learned quickly that walls do not simply contain, they enforce. To resist in such a space was futile. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The room itself was an accomplice, pressing in from every side, teaching the lesson of subjugation without a single word. Roman society understood this perfectly. The architecture of silence was more effective than chains. Chains could be broken, walls could not. Chains declare captivity. Walls disguise it as domestic order. A guest walking through a villa might never see the chamber, never hear the cries muffled by thick plaster. That invisibility was the point. Rome did not need to deny cruelty. It only needed to compartmentalize it. The parallels to Roman politics are chilling. Just as the Senate proclaimed liberty while presiding over an empire of slaves, so too did the villa proclaim refinement while hiding abuse. Public space and private space mirrored each other, grand display in one, silenced domination in the other. Rome's genius was not merely to conquer, but to normalize conquest until it disappeared into architecture, into law, into routine. Philosophers sometimes noticed. Seneca warned against luxury villas with more cubicular than family members. Juvenal mocked nobles who disappeared into painted chambers. But satire was safety valve, not rebellion. It turned atrocity into amusement. It allowed the elite to laugh at their own decadence, without ever questioning the system itself. The frescoes remained. the chambers remained, and the boys remained inside them. This is how cruelty become indestructible, not by being hidden, but by being embedded in stone. A villa could survive centuries' earthquakes, even volcanic eruption. When Pompeii was buried in 79 CE, the frescoes of Ganymede and Dionysus remained intact, their colours vivid, their myths still whispering divine justification. Archaeologists uncover them today and marvel at their artistry. Few linger on what those images really meant, that behind beauty lay silence, behind myth lay domination. So, we must confront the truth. The architecture of Rome was not neutral, it was complicit. Every column that impressed, every fresco that dazzled, every cubicular that concealed together, they formed a system where cruelty was not accidental, but designed. Rome's villas were monuments not only to wealth, but to erasure. They did not simply house people, they harvested silence. The open question now turns sharper when stone itself is built to conspire in domination. Does civilization preserve beauty or entomb atrocity? In the Roman world, beauty had a price, and the marketplace made it explicit. Walk into a slave auction in the capital, and you would find children lined up like cattle, their value announced with the cold precision of commerce. 10 denarii for a child scarred by labor, 30 for one considered unspoiled, twice that for a boy with pale skin, delicate features, or a voice that still held the sweetness of youth. The ledgers survive in fragments scratched on wax tablets, etched into stone reminders that in Rome beauty was not admired, it was bought. Traders knew their audience. Gauls were prized for their stature, Greeks for their refinement, Africans for their perceived exotic appeal. Boys with curly hair fetched higher prices in one province, boys with straight hair in another. Some markets emphasized the promise of music-singing flute-lyre skills that would adorn a feast. Others highlighted obedience trained to serve without protest. Every feature from eye color to the pitch of a scream could tip the scale of value. The transaction did not end at purchase. Masters treated the delicatus as an investment. Like fine horses or jewels, these boys required maintenance. They were trained to walk gracefully, to pour wine with elegance, to recite verses without faltering. They were dressed in silks adorned with earrings, their bodies groomed like ornaments. But beneath the polish lay the constant threat of replacement. The value of a boy was his youth, and youth withered quickly. A delicatus who aged into maturity became obsolete, often sold into labor mines or gladiatorial pits once his beauty faded. This is the cruelty of Rome's economy of beauty. The more exquisite the ornament, the more disposable it became. Masters rarely grew attached because attachment was inefficient. A boy who smiled beautifully today might be discarded tomorrow when a younger purchase appeared on the block. Economics ensured detachment, profit required it. And yet the economy was not only financial, it was symbolic. To own beautiful boys was to declare power, refinement, control over resources that others could only envy. Guests at dinner parties were shown delicati, as one might show fine silver or imported wine. Their presence was a mark of rank proof that the master could command not only wealth, but silence. For the boy himself, the training was not a path to dignity, but a descent into objecthood. Every gesture rehearsed, every smile performed, every word, memorized each, turned him into a living commodity, a luxury good trapped in human skin. Consider how chillingly efficient this system became. Markets provided supply. Architecture provided concealment. Law provided legitimacy. Philosophy provided silence. Together they created an economy where children were not accidents of cruelty, but products of demand. Rome's grandeur was not simply marble arches and triumphs. It was also the hum of markets where flesh was appraised like grain or wine. What did this do to Roman psychology? To stand at auction, to hear the price of a boy announced, to watch noblemen inspect him as though he were livestock. This normalized cruelty. It taught elites to see beauty as possession, to interpret human fragility as a luxury to be consumed. The very act of purchase erased empathy. The coin hit the table, and a child ceased to be a person. He became a lesser thing whose purpose was to ornament someone else's power. But beneath the surface, cracks spread. When an empire turns beauty into investment, it corrodes its own idea of humanity. How could Rome claim to represent civilization while reducing children to commodities? How could philosophers speak of dignity while ignoring markets where dignity was erased with a price tag? This is the hypocrisy that haunts the Roman legacy. Cruelty dressed as refinement, domination masked as luxury. And so the question sharpens: if beauty itself becomes a currency of power, how long before a society loses the ability to recognize beauty as anything other than ownership? If the marketplace turned children into commodities, it was Roman law that gave this atrocity permanence. Rome prided itself on its jurisprudence, on its ability to codify rights, duties, and contracts with clarity. But when it came to slavery, that clarity became a weapon. The jurists did not hesitate, did not obfuscate. A slave was res a thing, not a citizen, not even a person, a possession. This was the foundation of dominium, absolute ownership. Under Dominia Potestas, the master had the legal right to use, abuse, sell, or kill his slaves without facing accusation of crime. To modern ears, this sounds like an aberration, a distortion of law. To Rome, it was the essence of law hierarchy crystallized into statute. Jurists like Gaius and Ulpian did not lament this. They recorded it as fact, as if describing the weight of a stone or the flow of a river. Law was not the limit of cruelty, it was its shield. Consider how the system functioned. If a neighbor damaged your slave, you could bring legal action. But the action was not for assault, it was for property damage. The injured party was not the enslaved child whose body had been broken, but the master who had lost value in his asset. In this way, cruelty was not only normalized, it was incentivized. The law cared about suffering only insofar as it created financial loss. No Roman court would punish a master for harming his own slave. To do so would require acknowledging that a slave had personhood, that he could be a victim. And to grant personhood would unravel the entire Roman economy. The silence was not accidental. It was systemic. Rome's greatness demanded that silence because without it, the contradictions of its empire would collapse. Even philosophy bent to this logic. Stoics like Seneca sometimes wrote about treating slaves with relative kindness, not because slaves were equal, but because cruelty reflected poorly on the master's character. Seneca advised owners to remember that slaves were men, but in the same breath insisted that their servitude was natural fated. Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor, filled his meditations with thoughts on duty and justice. Even as his empire pulsed with the unfree, Philosophy did not break the silence, it decorated it, providing noble words that distracted from systemic atrocity. Religion offered no refuge either. Roman religion was transactional sacrifice in exchange for divine favor. Its gods were not protectors of the weak, but models of domination. Myths of Zeus, abducting Ganymede, or Apollo loving Hyacinth gave theological cover to practices inside the villa. What the gods performed in myth men could repeat in stone rooms without shame. Law, philosophy, and religion, three pillars of Roman civilization, all converged to legitimize the pleasure chamber. The danger here is not only the cruelty itself, but the rationalization of cruelty. When law declares that no crime exists, cruelty becomes invisible. When philosophers insist that suffering is natural, cruelty becomes acceptable. When myths turn domination into divinity, cruelty becomes beautiful. This is not chaos, it is order. It is cruelty woven so tightly into the structure of civilization that it ceases to look like cruelty at all. And yet the cracks were visible even then. Some voices hinted at unease. Juvenal mocked nobles who indulged too openly in their chambers. Petronius in his Satyricon satirized the grotesque appetites of Rome's wealthy. But mockery was a safe mask. To laugh at excess was permissible. To condemn the system was unthinkable. No satire ever challenged the core legal fact: a slave was not a person. No philosopher ever demanded abolition. The silence was not born of ignorance. It was born of complicity. Imagine the psychological effect on the enslaved boys themselves. To know that no court could defend you, that no law recognized your pain, that your very existence was written out of the ledger of humanity. This was domination at its deepest level. Hatred can be resisted, but indifference crushes. The law did not hate slaves, it erased them. And erasure is harder to fight than violence, because it leaves nothing to strike back against. This is why the pleasure chamber was not a secret vice, but a legal inevitability. Once law defines a child as res, everything that follows, market architecture, ritual, flows naturally. There is no crime in the chamber because there is no victim. There is no victim because the law says there is no person. And so, cruelty becomes not transgression, but obedience to the legal order itself. The hypocrisy of Rome lies bare. It celebrated itself as the civilization of law, yet its most enduring law was the sanctification of cruelty. It wrote volumes on contracts and rights, yet denied the most basic right to millions. It erected arches to liberty, while ensuring liberty was defined only by the enslavement of others. Rome's law was not the shield of the weak, it was the architecture of silence. And so the open question returns with force. When a civilization's highest achievement, the law itself, erases the humanity of its most vulnerable, is that law justice at all? Or is it simply the codification of domination polished until cruelty becomes indistinguishable from order? What does it mean to live in a world where you are not hated but ignored? For the enslaved boys of Rome, the most crushing weight was not the lash or the rope, but the indifference of those who owned them. Hatred at least acknowledges the other's existence. Indifference erases it. To a Roman master reclining on his couch, the boy kneeling nearby was not an enemy, not even a servant in the moral sense. He was furniture, useful, decorative, and replaceable. This is the true psychology of domination, not sadism in every moment, but normalization. The master did not wake each morning thinking of cruelty. He woke thinking of breakfast, of politics, of guests, and when he called for a boy to pour wine or to kneel at his feet, he thought of it no differently than summoning a slave to fetch sandals. For him, it was routine. For the boy, it was a collapse of self day after day until his own inner life felt unreal. The cruelty lay precisely in this gap. A boy who resisted, who cried, fought, or refused, was not merely punished. He disrupted the master's world, a world that had no room for resistance. Punishment was swift and brutal. Whipping, starvation, chaining sometimes sail to the mines where survival was measured in weeks. Resistance was not crushed out of rage. It was crushed to restore order. Submission, on the other hand, was rewarded lighter duties, finer food, sometimes a gesture of praise. The lesson was clear. Erase yourself, and you may live a little longer. Over time, this produced a generational cycle. Older boys broken into silence became models for younger ones. Without speaking, they taught the new arrivals how to survive. Smile when summoned. Bow your head. Do not meet the master's gaze. Do not resist when hands pull at your tunic. Survival passed not through rebellion, but through mimicry. Silence became tradition, learned not in words, but in posture. For the masters, this cycle reinforced their worldview. They saw obedience as natural proof that the boys were made for submission. A silent smile confirmed their belief in hierarchy. They mistook trauma for compliance, endurance for consent. And so they told themselves that domination was not cruelty, but culture, that their behavior was not aberration, but refinement. In this way, psychology and ideology reinforced each other in a closed loop. Indifference was more powerful than hatred because it hollowed out empathy. A master who hates must look at the object of his hatred. A master who is indifferent need not look at all. He can sip his wine while a boy kneels, speak of politics while a child suffers at his feet, and never feel contradiction. This is why Roman cruelty could last for centuries. It did not require monsters at every turn. It required ordinary men who accepted erasure as normal. Philosophers helped seal this mindset. Seneca urged masters to treat slaves humanely, but his reasoning was selfish. Cruelty reflects poorly on the master, he said, not because the slave suffers. Marcus Aurelius wrote of cosmic duty, but could not see the boys in his own palaces as part of that cosmos. Juvenal mocked gluttony, but never questioned why children were bought at market. Their words reinforced indifference, cloaking it as wisdom. For the boys themselves, the psychological violence was unbearable. To scream and not be heard, to suffer and not be acknowledged, to realize that your pain was less than the crack of a cup dropped on marble. This was annihilation of the self. Many boys broke, retreating into silence so deep they barely spoke, even when commanded. Some disassociated, drifting through their days like ghosts. Others hardened into shells, surviving until they were too old to be of interest, only to be discarded into harsher labor. And yet, indifference is never absolute. Sometimes a master noticed the beauty fading, the silence breaking the scars that spoiled the ornament. In those moments, cruelty sharpened into punishment, a reminder that the boy was not forgotten. He was remembered only as an object failing in its purpose. Invisibility could protect for a time, but never forever. This is the psychology. Rome perfected domination as habit cruelty, as routine erasure, as normality. It was not the occasional sadist that sustained the system, but the everyday indifference of thousands of men who never thought of themselves as cruel, who saw silence and mistook it for harmony. The open question now cuts deeper: if cruelty can become normal through indifference. How many civilizations mistake silence for consent and rot from within without ever noticing? Empire is not sustained by battles alone. It is sustained by memory, by repetition, by the passing of practices from one generation to the next until cruelty becomes tradition. In Rome, domination was not only taught on battlefields or in courts, it was taught at home in the villa, in the chambers where silence ruled. The cycle of inheritance was not simply about land or titles. It was about the transfer of bodies. Imagine the scene: a senator's son turning 14, stepping into manhood. His father hosts a dinner, calls for wine, speaks of duty and honor before his peers. Then, as part of his initiation, the boy is presented with a delicatus, not a gift of gold, not a horse, but a living child purchased, groomed, and now offered as both luxury and lesson. This was how Roman fathers taught their sons the true meaning of power. To own a delicatus was to learn the grammar of domination, to perform it as naturally as pouring wine or giving orders. The villas themselves staged this inheritance. A boy who had served one master might, upon the master's death, be passed to his son or brother. The law recognized no interruption. Slaves were property distributed like cattle or furniture. There are accounts of wills where delicati are listed alongside jewels and silver, their names omitted, replaced with descriptors. The beautiful one, the singer, the boy with curly hair. To be inherited was to lose even the possibility of change. A child's fate could be written into parchment centuries before his own death. This cycle bred continuity. Sons of senators grew up watching their fathers summon boys into chambers, hearing laughter behind closed doors, witnessing silence treated as normal. By the time they inherited power, they did not see cruelty. They saw tradition. They repeated what they had learned because to do otherwise would disrupt the order on which their identity rested. To be Roman was to dominate. To dominate was to be Roman. And so cruelty was not reinvented each generation, it was copied. Fathers modeled it. Sons mimicked it. Slaves enforced it upon one another through silence and example. This is how systems survive, not by constant invention, but by endless repetition. The chamber behind the villa wall was not an aberration. It was a classroom. The boys themselves understood the inheritance too, but in darker ways. An older delicatus, nearing the end of his usefulness, might whisper a warning to a younger one. Smile when he looks at you. Do not resist. Live long enough to be sold elsewhere. In this way, trauma became curriculum. Survival strategies passed from boy to boy, from generation of captives to the next, creating a second inheritance, an inheritance of silence, endurance, and despair. The paradox of Rome lies here. It claimed to be eternal, destined by the gods. But its eternity was built on cycles of cruelty that devoured themselves. Every boy consumed in a chamber, every family line extinguished, every silence passed forward, hollowed out the society that believed itself unbreakable. Inheritance ensured repetition, but repetition ensured corrosion. Philosophers again played their part. They spoke of tradition, of customs handed down as the fabric of Rome. but they never asked what those customs meant for the voiceless. Tradition was celebrated when it meant festivals, rituals, triumphs. Tradition was ignored when it meant fathers gifting their sons human ornaments. Silence was inherited as surely as marble statues or land titles. In this way, Rome became a civilization that taught cruelty as if it were literacy. A senator's son learned to read Latin, to declaim Cicero, to admire Homer, and to call for his delicatus without shame. Education and domination were inseparable. Both defined what it meant to be Roman. Both were rehearsed daily in the villa, in the chambers, in the quiet exchange of ownership. The cycle of inheritance explains why no reform emerged. If cruelty is taught as culture, there is no reformer, only heirs. To question the system was to question the very fabric of Roman identity. And so the cycle turned, each generation engraving the same lessons into flesh, each chamber echoing the same silence. The open question intensifies if cruelty can be inherited as tradition. Can any civilization escape its own shadow, or does it inevitably raise sons who will repeat their father's silence? What makes a system invincible? Not its armies, not its marble, but the absence of consequence. Rome's machinery of cruelty endured for centuries, not because it was hidden, but because it was never punished. No court ever tried a master for what he did in his chambers. No senate ever debated the fate of delicati. No law ever recognized a crime. The system did not fail because it was too secret. It thrived because it was too normal. Satirists provided the illusion of critique. Juvenal joked about noblemen exhausting themselves with their boys. Petronius lampooned the grotesque appetites of elites in his Satyricon. But satire is a safety valve, not a sword. It mocked excess while leaving the system intact. To laugh at cruelty was to trivialize it, to make it part of Rome's social fabric. The audience chuckled, nodded knowingly, and went home to repeat the very practices they had laughed at. Even freedom was no escape. A boy who survived long enough might eventually be granted manumission. On paper, he became a free man. In reality, he carried the indelible stain of having once been a delicatus. Roman society never let him forget. Freed slaves bore stigma. Servitutis, the mark of slavery. If his past was known, whispers followed him. He had been kept, used, trained. No amount of dignity could erase what the villa had carved into his body and reputation. Some tried to start anew, but silence stalked them. Others descended into poverty, unable to shed the shadow of their youth. Freedom was not a rebirth. It was another form of exile. This is how the system protected itself. Even escape reinforced silence. If the freed delicatus spoke, he risked ridicule, ostracism, or violence. If he remained silent, the system remained invisible. Most chose silence, and so, history itself conspired. No memoirs survive, no letters, no scrolls. The delicati remain voiceless, not only because their masters silenced them, but because survival required it. Silence became their last act of endurance. Meanwhile, Rome's elites flourished. Villas grew larger frescoes, more elaborate entertainments, more extravagant. Abroad, Rome projected order law codes, armies, architecture, the language of discipline. At home, rot spread through the core. The contradiction was stark. To the world, Rome was the paragon of justice. Within its villas, justice did not exist. The empire that prided itself on legal clarity institutionalized its darkest practices through ambiguity, euphemism, and indifference. This is the irony. Rome's greatness abroad mirrored its corruption at home. The same Senate that debated treaties ignored screams behind its walls. The same generals who triumphed in Gaul purchased boys from the provinces they conquered. Conquest abroad meant conquest at home, replayed on smaller, more intimate scales. Rome expanded outward by devouring inward. The system required this duality. Publicly, cruelty had no place in the ideology of virtus. Privately, cruelty was the very definition of Roman power. No scandal erupted because scandal requires transgression, and in Rome there was none. To call it a crime, you must admit a victim. To admit a victim, you must admit a person. The law refused, and so the chambers endured. Some Romans whispered unease. A few philosophers hinted that indulgence weakened the state, that luxury made men soft. But they worried about the masters, not the boys. Their concern was national strength, not human dignity. They asked, would Rome lose its military edge if elites drowned in pleasure? They did not ask, what does it mean to build civilization on broken children? The wrong question guaranteed the wrong answers. And so the system persisted, generation after generation, immune to reform, insulated by silence. Cruelty without consequence is not an accident. It is design. Rome engineered not only the domination of bodies, but the erasure of accountability. What was mocked in satire, excused in philosophy, sanctioned in law, and concealed in architecture, all converged into a system that devoured lives while calling itself eternal. The climactic confrontation sharpens here. Rome's cruelty was not a deviation from its greatness. It was its essence. The law that defined liberty for citizens defined property for slaves. The villas that embodied refinement embodied domination. The empire that conquered the world conquered its own children in silence. The open question burns when the most celebrated civilization of law builds its foundations on unpunished cruelty. What does that say about law itself? Was Rome's true legacy order, or the perfection of erasure? Rome's poets and generals claimed that the empire's greatness rested on discipline law and divine favor. But peel away the marble, and another philosophy emerges, one far darker, yet far more consistent domination as pleasure. Rome did not simply conquer foreign lands. It conquered bodies, wills, and silences. The private villa, with its chambers and cubicula, was not separate from the empire's destiny. It was its mirror. Consider the logic. On campaign, Roman legions subdued provinces, seized captives, and paraded them through triumphal arches. At home, noblemen subdued boys, paraded them through chambers, and displayed them at banquets. The methods differed in scale, but not in essence. Both were acts of conquest performed for spectacle, designed to remind the powerful that their freedom was measured by the submission of others. Law did not enter the battlefield. It sanctified conquest after the fact. In the same way, law did not enter the villa chamber. It sanctified possession by calling the boy res. Publicly, the empire boasted of justice. Privately, it relied on erasure. The pattern was identical because it was philosophical. To be Roman meant not merely to obey law, but to dominate through it. This is why the chamber must be understood not as a hidden perversion, but as the distilled form of Roman philosophy. Inside those painted walls, the values of the empire found their purest expression. Domination was aestheticized as beauty, normalized as culture, and institutionalized as law. The master reclined on his couch, not feeling cruelty, but refinement. The same way generals felt triumph rather than slaughter. Cruelty in Rome was never called by its name. It was called order. And the indifference that sustained the system was not moral failure. It was moral design. Rome trained its citizens to see humanity in citizens alone. Beyond that boundary, others became tools, laborers, ornaments. This exclusivity defined Roman liberty. Freedom existed only because unfreedom was omnipresent. A senator's dignity derived from the boy kneeling beside him, just as Rome's liberty derived from the provinces it had crushed into obedience. Liberty without domination was inconceivable. What does this tell us about the psychology of Rome's greatness? That its most enduring contribution was not aqueducts or law codes, but the fusion of domination with pleasure, the elevation of cruelty into philosophy. The delicatus was not a vice, it was a lesson. The chamber was not a deviation, it was pedagogy. Each generation of elites learned through bodies what Cicero and Seneca tried to capture in words that power is most secure when it does not need to explain itself. And yet this philosophy carried within it the seeds of collapse. By equating domination with identity, Rome created an empire incapable of reform. How can you abolish cruelty when cruelty is the very definition of citizenship? How can you extend rights to others when your own liberty depends on their silence? Rome was trapped in the logic of its own system. To undo the chamber would be to undo the empire. And so the chamber remained until the empire itself disintegrated. This is why the governing question matters: was Roman cruelty about purification or control? The answer reveals itself here. Purification would require intent to cleanse, to improve. Control required only silence. Rome's chambers were not designed to cleanse anyone. They were designed to train submission, to erase individuality, to feed the philosophy of domination that defined the empire. Cruelty was never a byproduct. It was the essence of rule. The villa was not separate from the forum. The bedchamber was not separate from the battlefield. Both were theatres of conquest. Both revealed the same philosophy that greatness requires victims and that victims must remain silent. Rome built marble arches to honour its victories abroad. Its villas, hidden and windowless, were the arches of its victories at home. And so the open loop narrows. Rome's grandeur was never free. It was purchased daily in bodies and silence. Its true philosophy was not justice, but erasure. The chamber proves it, because in the chamber, Rome stripped away the disguise of law and revealed its core principle. Power is not about governance, but possession. The unresolved question lingers if domination itself is philosophy. What happens to a civilization when it consumes everything it can dominate? What became of them? The boys who poured wine at feasts, who knelt in painted chambers, who learned to smile on command. Rome's records are silent. No names etched into marble, no scrolls preserved in libraries, no epitaphs in graveyards. Their lives ended the way they were lived, in erasure. And yet, archaeology, fragments of law, and the whispers of satire allow us to trace their shadow. Many died young. Some from the sheer violence of use, bodies broken before adulthood. Others from disease, starvation, despair. Roman villas had no shortage of graves for infants and children. Some hastily dug into courtyards, others hidden in refuse pits. Archaeologists have unearthed skeletons with signs of malnutrition. Broken bones that never healed, jaws worn down by stress. None were given the honors of Roman burial. They were not citizens, not remembered. Their bones are their only testimony. Others aged out of beauty. The delicatus system prized youth above all. When the softness faded, the boy became surplus. Many were sold into labor mines where survival averaged months, quarries where men suffocated under dust fields where exhaustion was the only escape. Some were sent to gladiator schools, their bodies now repurposed for public spectacle. The boy who once played Apollo in a villa chamber might be forced to fight to the death before a crowd that never knew his name. In Rome, even obsolescence became commodity. A few survived long enough to be manumitted. A freed delicatus might live outwardly as a free man, but the stigma followed him like a scar. Romans whispered, neighbors remembered. His past was etched into his reputation. He had once been someone's ornament, someone's silence. Freedmen sometimes rose to wealth, but never to dignity. The villa knew what he had been. Society knew what he had endured. Freedom in Rome was not rebirth. It was a mask stretched over degradation. And yet perhaps the most enduring fate was not death or survival, but forgetting. Rome erased its victims so completely that even modern history often overlooks them. No chronicler recorded the anguish of a boy given as a coming-of-age gift. No poet composed an elegy for the child discarded into a quarry. The silence was deliberate. Acknowledgement would demand reform. Reform would threaten power. And so silence triumphed not only in life, but in memory. This is the final domination to be erased not just as a person, but as a story. Rome immortalized generals, senators, and emperors in marble and bronze. The delicati, the enslaved, the invisible dead, they were left to vanish into soil and ash. Their absence is everywhere. Every villa wall without a name, every fresco without a face, every law that speaks of property but never of people. Silence is not absence, it is conquest. Yet, archaeology refuses silence. Child skeletons, unearthed at sites like Isola Sacra Pompeii and Herculaneum, bear the marks of a life cut short. Bones of adolescence reveal stress fractures from overused teeth eroded by malnutrition. Some skeletons show evidence of deliberate burial alongside household refuse, confirming that for many, even in death, they were considered disposable. These bones contradict Rome's silence. They tell us what the ledgers refused to say, that behind marble grandeur lay generations of broken children. The cruelty lingers not only in what happened, but in how it was never acknowledged. Satirists joked, philosophers looked away. Jurists codified silence. Rome did not forget its delicati. By accident, it buried them deliberately, the way one buries dangerous truths. And so, when we walk through Roman ruins today, we see columns and frescoes, but not the boys who once served beneath them. We see beauty without cost, power without victims. That is the greatest illusion Rome ever performed. And yet, the illusion cannot hold forever. Every civilization that erases its victims eventually leaves cracks. The delicati may be absent from the chronicles, but their absence itself is testimony. The silence is too complete, too structured, too deliberate. It reveals the truth that cruelty was not a deviation, but the core. Rome's greatness was built not on what it remembered, but on what it forced the world to forget. The governing question presses harder if civilization defines itself by what it records. What does it mean? When its greatest monuments stand on unmarked graves, Rome fell, but the chamber survived. Not in brick or fresco, but in pattern, because the philosophy. Suavi Rome perfected domination, as pleasure, cruelty as order did not end with the collapse of the Western Empire. It resurfaced again and again wherever power was left unchecked. Consider Tiberius retreating to Capri in the 1st century CE, surrounding himself with boys, forced into silence. His villa transformed into a stage of cruelty, no different from those of his predecessors. Consider Gilles de Rais in 15th century France, nobleman and war hero who consumed children in rituals of domination eerily reminiscent of Rome's chambers. Consider the hidden networks of modern trafficking, where children are priced, trained, and erased with the same cold logic as in Roman markets 2,000 years earlier. The continuity is chilling. Rome's chamber is not antiquity, it is archetype. This is the resolution of our governing question. Was Roman cruelty about divine purification or about control? The answer is clear. Purification implies purpose beyond itself, a cleansing of body or soul. But Rome's cruelty had no such end. It was not ritual, it was strategy. It taught submission, enforced silence, and aestheticized domination so completely that cruelty became indistinguishable from culture. Rome's chambers were not aberrations of luxury. They were mechanisms of control, polished into philosophy. And this philosophy survives because it is seductive. It tells the powerful that their liberty depends on another's silence. It convinces civilizations that greatness is measured not by what they protect, but by what they can erase. It hides atrocity behind law, beauty, or tradition, until no one dares to call it by its name. That was Rome's true legacy, not marble, not aqueducts, not law codes, but the pattern of cruelty disguised as civilization. Archaeology forces us to listen to the voices Rome buried. Bones unearthed in Pompeii and Isola. Sacra, whisper of children worked to death. Frescoes of Ganymede remind us how myth was weaponized to normalize abduction. Satirists' jokes expose how indifference concealed atrocity. Every fragment we recover testifies against the silence Rome engineered. And when the ledgers close, the bones still speak. What makes this warning urgent is not the past, but the present. Every time a society defines freedom only for some, it recreates Rome's logic. Every time a law reduces people to objects, it repeats the jurisprudence of res. Every time architecture hides exploitation behind beauty, it builds another chamber. The system does not need emperors or togas. It needs only indifference, euphemism, and the absence of consequence. The old kingdom of Egypt collapsed when Pepi II consumed his own people in cruelty. The Roman Empire fractured after centuries of silent domination hollowed its core. Cruelty cannot sustain civilization. It corrodes, it erases its memory, and leaves only ruins for future archaeologists to puzzle over. Rome's fate is the clearest proof. It devoured itself from within. Not through war alone, but through the philosophy it enshrined in law, architecture, and silence. And so the pattern survives as a warning. Civilization is always one unchecked ruler, one unchallenged tradition, one unspoken silence away from recreating the chamber. Rome reminds us that cruelty does not begin with monsters. It begins with normalization, with indifference, with silence. We opened with a question. Was Rome's cruelty about divinity or about control? We close with the answer. It was control. Systematic, aestheticized, unpunished control. Rome's greatness was measured not in marble, but in erased names, not in law, but in silence. And if we fail to recognize the pattern, we risk repeating it. Because when the ledgers close, when the chronicles fall silent, the bones still